Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. Welcome back if you've been here before. If not, this is a daily, weekdays we come daily to you at 12:30 and we chew it over. We talk about whatever's topical at the time usually with guests, and we have one today that's absolutely brilliant thinker in this space. Managed to stir the hornet's nest yesterday, far more than I anticipated. So in some quarters, but turns out that some people have a real sense of identity with the term allied health professional. And what I've then concluded that it's practically and politically pertinent sometimes. But yeah, I struggle to find understanding of it as a identity between a professional one and say healthcare professionals, which is more descriptive. But some people are really into that. So it's going to be one that I imagine we'll have to revisit because I think people want to pick my brains on that a little more. But enough of that, and maybe we'll come to that tomorrow. But today, we're going to be talking about something that's never contentious, which is the use of touch, the use of hands, manual therapy, massage, with what I consider to be one of the leading massage therapists I've ever met, and someone that just is very thoughtful about how he's going about describing it, very involved in introducing rehab to these disciplines, as well as reconceptualizing it through a massive new show called the Massage Matters podcast, run by him and his colleagues Anna Maria and Becky. So without further ado, I'll bring you Matt Scarsbrook, and we're going to chew over the use of touch. And he's going to get all philosophical, he's told me. He's just shown me all these reams of notes, which has obviously scared me. Here he is. Matt, can you hear us?
I can, thank you. Yeah, hi. How are you?
Not so bad. Nervous though. Like I said, you've put the winds up me now, showing me your notes and telling me you're going to talk about philosophy. You all saw the extent of my philosophical knowledge, just naming some names earlier. Was it last week?
Yeah, I think it was last week. It blew me away. I was like, right, in that case, if he's got the happy sleeve, let's bring him back out again. You
just couldn't see me reading some names.
Reading your notes. Well, as I say, I've got my notes as well today because basically the reason I wanted to jump on as much as anything else was I figured it's quite a cool forum for a bit of a public brain dump about some stuff that I've been mulling over, and in particular touching on some elements that have come in from yourself and from some others over the last week or two that really have kind of triggered where I've gone with this. So what I'll probably do is, if it's all right, is I'll try and do a good 15-minute introduction before opening back up to you. But just
about
kind of
14 minutes in, you remember that you should put a question mark at the end of it. That's what I usually do. Yeah.
There is a question in there, but it is rhetorical, and then we can come back to it. But
cool. I do definitely want you to sort of frame why we wanted to talk about this, because it won't be the last time we visit this sort of general topic, but certainly, people understanding what the philosophy of touch, etc. was. It's a vague title.
What was it about? Absolutely, yeah.
You got to give us something.
It was clickbait, wasn't it? Yeah. So there were basically there's four main triggers that have kind of pulled together my thinking for today. So the first one was listening to session 82 with Michelle Angus from the Physio Matters podcast on acute back pain. And in particular, a very, I thought, beautifully phrased question, but very cheeky and could have been explored a lot further, I think, which is, if in ED, you're providing some form of analgesia in order to help someone, reassure them, and essentially get them back to movement, which is the primary goal that Michelle was discussing. You asked, why would you not provide a menu of other analgesic components such as massage? And there was a beautiful element of silence from Michelle while she was trying to think that one over, and came back with, well, it's not the job. And that struck me as both totally true and quite incongruous at the same time, because surely in that scenario, providing analgesia by way of rebuilding confidence is in fact the job. And to provide someone who in that scenario is in acute back pain, the confidence that actually hurt doesn't mean harm and they can continue moving and get themselves well again. And you continue to make the point that the go-to is medication, and should it be? So I thought that was quite a poignant bit for me. Monday earlier this week, chewing it over, so I'm afraid this is you again. But you were talking obviously about your views at the moment about this sort of contentiousness between population-based evidence and RCTs, and then the sort of subjective lived experience, and how neither is perfect, and if you're sitting in one camp or the other, you are missing a fundamental component of the whole. And for me, obviously, the way that I see manual therapy being interpreted is often in that subjective lived experience, which I think, as you pointed out, eventually that just leads to chaos if that's all we can rely on. But I think it's well recognised that a formal RCT, the gold standard that we know and love, doesn't apply well to things like manual therapy, where there is clearly a subjective element to it.
Mm-hmm.
So then that brings me on to a series of posts by the ever eloquent Adam Meakins over the last week or so, where he creates some beautiful polarity with discussions over the efficacy of certain manual interventions, based upon, I think we could recognize as the traditional beliefs about what these interventions are doing. So he's quite rightly talking about the fact that myofascial release is in fact not releasing fascia. If there is an adhesion in there, that you need a scalpel rather than good fingers. But again, I think it pulled into a bit of Monday's Chewing It Over, where you're discussing the fact that actually there's quite a polarity here, and almost there is an element of nuance that has to try to bring RCTs and subjective together in some way.
On that, I imagine you've seen Matt Phillips' interview with Paul Ingraham.
Yes.
And just to flag that, and you can go on, but it's just that I think Adam is one of the people that Paul's on about when he thinks that Adam struggles to even comprehend. And in interviews with me, especially the one that we did famously drunk, for our millionth download or whatever it was, he said to me, just on air, just like, can you even comprehend seeking out massage for hands-on care for when you're in pain? And I was like, well, yeah, I can. I don't think I do instinctively as much, but I can comprehend it very easily. And the fact that he can't, I think he's one of those people that really struggles to even, it's just foreign to him, and therefore part of his identity then becoming against it is because he can't really get that. So I know that, I hope that sort of adds to your plethora of other things.
It does. It absolutely adds. And in actual fact, Adam might take great pleasure in discovering who he is as a result of the next piece that I'm going to talk about, which is the results of something called the touch test, which was a huge internet-based questionnaire, essentially, that was set up by Goldsmiths and UCL in collaboration with the Wellcome Trust and BBC4, or BBC Radio 4, I should say, who have been kind of presenting some of the results as they've been generated. Now, obviously, touch as a general overview has been kind of in the news quite a lot, obviously, because of lockdown and the lack of being able to hug your parents and your mates and all that kind of stuff. But coincidentally, this piece of research was conducted, started in January this year, and it actually finished the first week of lockdown. So predominantly it was focused at a period of time when actually there were no restrictions around touch. And what they managed to do is they managed to generate something like close to 40,000 responses from 112 countries around the world, looking at people's perception of touch, cultural differences in the perception of touch. And there's lots and lots of different elements that have been pulled out already and will continue to be pulled out of the data. It's early stuff that's being discussed now, but a lot of it I think is quite relevant to the conversations, I suppose, that I've been having in my own head and that I'm hoping to have here. And that is, so that then leads me, taking all these 4 bits, to my first rhetorical question, which is, if you wouldn't deny a patient in pain a paracetamol as part of a treatment plan to get them mobilized again and get them moving, why would you deny them massage?
Yeah, well, I'm rejecting it as a hypothetical. I'm going to just try and answer it because I think that you end up in this space where, as you heard with my angle of questioning with Michelle,
Mhm.
and also where many people have heard me go before with this, is that the understanding of mechanisms has helped us to understand, especially when we've come to recognize the mechanism of effect that has deleterious effects from medication sometimes, and the opioid epidemic, etc., has meant that then you end up in this situation where it's trying to do a similar thing in which you're trying to offer some relief, which we understand to be very individual. As to how people experience that, and the context is super relevant, and all the biopsychosocial factors affecting it. And so you end up in a situation where that you can make the case that realistically you shouldn't be considering these things as being particularly different. Being a tablet analgesic and say some manual therapy, especially if it's something that someone has the association to one of the two, that would mean that they would prefer it, right? However, one of the big challenges is that in philosophical terms, we often think about individual priors, like where are you coming from with that at the base level. I'd say that this one, it would say more of a sociological, sort of societal prior as to what the association is to what that intervention is doing. And as I think I said on that podcast, or you might have heard me say before, is that no one attributes the paracetamol, or very few people would attribute the paracetamol to their recovery from a pathology, injury, incident. They don't recognize it as being something that is doing anything other than altering their neurological experience. It's something that they're comprehending, it just messing with the wiring to some extent. Whereas the strong association to the mechanism of effect of any manual intervention, and then not just massage here, but certainly when you get to manipulation, things like that, or even especially your deeper tissue massages and stuff, the inference that it is corrective in a sense, that it is actually disease modifying, for want of a better term, right? And I know Jack March and Mike Dare and others that are more in that medical side will be mortified at me using that, but it's just that in this instance, that the difference between a paracetamol and a DMARD, essentially, where you're actually making a real obvious and overt difference to someone's physiology, and in this case, sometimes even perceiving their anatomy. That sociological prior, I'm probably saying that badly, but that's so relevant, in my opinion, to whether or not that these things should be done, even though I'm agreeing on the base level that it shouldn't be considered different, but it just is.
So I suppose then the question to counter that question is it the treatment that's the problem, or is it the education around that? And I mean both therapists, but also general public, and the lack of, I suppose, the lack of effort of therapists to communicate this to the public to a certain extent, that actually it does work, and it works through biological and neurological mechanisms that we can explain, and that I'll dive into in a minute. And that's the reason that it's useful. And to a certain extent, we should then treat it a bit like, perhaps, I'm hoping I don't get shot for this one, but a bit like a painkiller, as part of the treatment process to eventually end up rehabilitating this individual with movement, with exercise, with all the good stuff that comes out of RCTs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is in the education, but I just think that there is a relevant upper limit that we need to understand as to how well you can educate therapists, Joe public. Fast forward 100 years. I mean, that seems scary to think about what that would do in the context in which we'd be in 100 years. But just imagine we were to take everything else as being the same, but we were able to improve the sort of literacy and understanding of what massage, say, just does or doesn't do, or touch does and doesn't do. Then I think that you're in a situation where it just becomes a very different philosophical question. So I think it is not in the actual intervention, it's in the perception of the intervention. However, I do want to make sure that I'm clear in saying that I'm torn as to just how much impact we can make, because even in, if we think about the cross-cultural studies that have been done in and around touch, I certainly need to investigate this data that you're talking about now, but when I've looked at it cross-culturally and thought, well, is it something that's been quite westernized in that we've sort of commoditized touch in a way, And you look at it and you think that across different societies, the mechanism of effect that's sometimes inferred is sometimes different. But even within sort of Eastern philosophy, it's often the specificity of it. And they might not be suggesting and inferring that they're changing tissue changes, but they're definitely, the alteration of flows of chi, etc., becomes very similarly. Like the specificity still carries with it. And so because of that, I worry that how much can we truly influence that?
So to take that apart a little bit, I would say the West commoditizing touch. I'd say we're more blatant about it, but I'd say that touch in the East is just from a massage and well-being perspective, touch in the East is just more a part of daily life. You don't necessarily book in for a massage. You just go round your mates and you're having a cup of tea and someone's providing massage. It's a social aspect of life as opposed to let me go on Google and see who the best sports therapist locally is. So I'd say that touch in that sense does sort of transcend culture. The big differences that have come out of the touch test from a cultural perspective are the differences in what is acceptable in public and what's in private. And generally speaking, it appears that the Western world, albeit there are differences between gender and age ranges as well, which is quite interesting, but generally the Western world is more comfortable with a bit more public touch. And the the sort of Middle East in particular are less okay with public touch, but actually when behind closed doors, as it were, the hug between a mother and father or between a mother and son and all that that's all the same. So that's quite interesting. And when you then dig down into trying to understand a little bit more about, well, is touch subjective? So for me, a big question that comes out is that if we are operating under and this kind of touches on Monday's chewing over, but if we're operating under a patient-centered BPS framework, we have to recognize the relevance of the individual subjective and also the weaknesses of population-based RCTs. We have to. If you're truly client-centered and BPS, you have to recognize that both of them have a place. To me, that's a no-brainer, which is what you were arguing on Monday. But then I sort of asked, well, is massage subjective? So some of the interesting stats that have been pulled out of the touch test so far, 72% of respondents have a positive association or positive attitude to touch. Now, that obviously means that nearly a third don't, and you'd have to dive deeper into the data to work out what nuances there were with that negative association. But there certainly seems to be a bias towards whether you are an introvert or an extrovert. Unsurprisingly, extroverts do seem to respond or have more positive attitudes to touch. But there is also a type of personality almost that recognizes people who cope better through community and people who cope better on their own. Again, unsurprisingly, people who are more inclined to cope on their own are less likely to respond positively to touch. You've then got differences between gender, and again, women tend to respond more positively to touch in a self-care context, which could explain things like your pedicures and your manicures and your hairdressers and all that kind of stuff, because that's all touch self-care. Where men are actually more positive to touch in an intimate relationship, which I thought was quite interesting. There is a strong correlation between more regular and more recent touch and an increase in overall well-being and a decrease in reported loneliness. Okay, so there is definitely this social wellness aspect that comes from touch. Mm-hmm. And there does seem to be a very, very strong bias that quality is more important than quantity. So then when you kind of start going, well, okay, so if close to 3/4 of the population globally have said that they have a positive association to touch, is touch really subjective? And does our understanding, does the science underlying what might be going on when we're being touched and that positive association, does that corroborate, I suppose, this positive attitude to touch being a population-wide phenomena? And the answer is, it appears so, yes. So, anyone who's done anything pain science related will be aware of the different nerve endings in the skin, and the fact that your free nerve endings, for example, are your nociceptors, and you've got your Merkels and your Meissners and all that kind of stuff. In the 90s, we finally discovered a nerve ending that wraps around hair follicles. And what's really, really interesting, without going into too much detail about how they've done all this, but essentially it's an unmyelinated fiber that responds to a very, very specific type of touch. And this is where, interestingly, the specificity over techniques might come in. And that is, it responds most vigorously to a gentle, dynamic touch, i.e. moving, and that movement has to be between 3 and 10 centimeters per second, which by coincidence, design, or evolution, however you want to look at it, is the speed that most people would stroke a partner or a child, or some sort of careful, mindful caress is about that speed across the skin. Now, these receptors are only found in hairy skin. And so they're not on the palms of our hands. It's only on hairy skin. And for the ladies listening, hairy skin, unfortunately, does include things like your back and everywhere else, because actually, if it's not your hands or your soles of your feet or the inside of your lips, it's hairy skin. But that means that we are actually full of receptors that respond to a very specific type of touch in areas that most people would regard as pleasant when seeking massage. The back massage is nice for a reason, perhaps, because we actually have the highest density of these receptors on our backs. So then the next question is, well, why is that relevant? And through some subjects who unfortunately have neurological deficits in this area and some fantastic science, we've basically been able to track the nerve impulse from those nerve cells to the location of it that they activate in the brain, which is the insular cortex. And we know from other experiments that the insular cortex is predominantly involved in emotion, but actually also operates as a moderator for nociception. So now we've got potentially a link from the type of touch the individual receives to an emotional center in the brain, which we know moderates the nociceptive responses of the brain. We also know, again, from functional MRI scanning, that predominantly when you are touched by someone or something else, and anyone who's ever watched Lorimer Moseley prance around on stage will talk about the somatosensory cortex, we know that if someone else touches you in this nice way on the skin, then the somatosensory cortex fires. But we know if you do it yourself, it doesn't. And so, to me, there's an interesting kind of trail of breadcrumbs, if you will. I don't think it's anything stronger than that at the moment, but that is sort of taking suddenly mass population data, which we haven't had before, on people's subjective around touch, which generally is positive, but we can also identify scenarios where it's not positive. And we've also now got the underlying neuroscience to help explain perhaps some of those things that we perceive. And so if I take a very, if I take a bit of a leap perhaps, and I say, okay, so what could this line of breadcrumbs lead to? You could suggest that we now have a mechanism by which touch can relieve pain. It's not pharmacological. It has a reasonable basis for it, and as a result could be used as could be justified as analgesia to help someone with minor or chronic musculoskeletal pain get moving again.
And then it comes to the practical aspects of how that, what circumstances is that or isn't that appropriate based on a whole host of things, including the economics of it. With regards to where we go back to me and Michelle talking about it in ED, it would take for a shift in a significant shift in an economic model of what we'd understand in terms of value, as well as needing to measure it in that context and understand how we would triage that choice almost. So yeah, fascinating, and thank you for that. And I know we're just, I've got a few minutes, so I just wanted to pull some questions and comments up.
Oh, please do.
That was great. I've some lovely comments, especially early doors, about how, you know, Jeanette's saying about how she's always saying to her students, never underestimate the power of touch and its psychological impacts. And I think that most people would associate strongly with that. Joe Turner has weighed in here, and I like this one here. She's saying, hey patient, I'm going to try and alter the way in which your pain is behaving. I'm going to pull various things from my extensive hands-on and hands-off toolkit to achieve that. It's hilarious when you sort of try to, as if you would articulate it that way. But yeah, that's a brilliant one. Bernadette Johnson has shared that massage is a painkiller in the same way as paracetamol. It's pointless to deny the former to someone in pain. If anything, paracetamol is a blunt instrument, side effects. Massage is a nuanced approach. That's a really interesting point from Bernadette, who's a musculoskeletal patient herself involved in MSKR. There's quite a lot here. I want to pull up this one from Paula Clayton, though. He said, spanner in the works, how much does it matter? And of course, it's a fair point. And if a patient genuinely perceives improvement in activity levels and are therefore able to get back to being themselves, as long as that dialogue hasn't been leading, then is that not a success for the particular person? Let's take that one then.
So how much does it matter?
Are we just over nerding it?
Well, are we over nerding it? So how much does touch matter? I would sort of ask the question, do you believe everything you see? Do you believe everything you hear? Do you believe everything you feel? And is touch perhaps the best way, one of the most direct ways of communicating to someone in inverted commas, truth about the condition of their tissues? Because you can sit and talk pain science at them till the cows come home. Or you can communicate to them through one of their senses that they will regard as the most truthful. We know from early infant studies, for example, that the reason touch is important to an infant is because through someone else touching them, they start to perceive the external physical limits of themselves. You know, they don't necessarily start with the concept of my leg is over there. They only know their leg stops over there because someone's now touched the bottom of my foot. So we derive a huge amount of truth in a philosophical sense from touch. And so I would suggest that perhaps it is important as a means of communication to a patient for whom perhaps the verbal pain ed, the visual doesn't necessarily sit right with them.
I think with some of that, because I don't think that touch could inherently convey with it any sense of truth without the appropriate context, because of the way in which if touch was painful, and there was still that personal and social prior about what that would mean, and that it would only then inherently infer the truth of the matter to be that it is painful because it's damaged.
Yeah. And this, therefore, I think...
Go on.
No, I was going to say, and this, I think, comes back to education of therapists.
Yeah, and I think
Stop
as well...
hurting people with your modalities.
Well, no, I know. And it's just... what's fascinating to me is that there is something there, and it's only... But it's just that... Imagine that if you sterilize the environment in a metaphorical sense, to say that you're not going to try and give a positive or negative context, or give some clarity to what the touch means, and then look at this trying to develop that sense of safety via touch as a communicative act. It's that will come with it some sense of truth and accuracy in terms of its reality to the likelihood of that tissue being relevantly damaged or not, for example, or truly being safe to move. And I think that's where the inherent nature of it would need to be questioned, because if we were to therefore, if we were able to sort of sterilize it to some extent, it'd be interesting. I've
seen Paula's comment.
Yeah, I know. I've got Paula's loving these spanners in the works. I like being hurt by modality. All right, Paula, that's brilliant. She needs to come and justify that statement, but I'm not. I think none of us are surprised if we know Paula. But also, apologies to Joe Turner, who said she's not kidding. She would say that. I thought she was being really over literal, but no, she would say that. Fair enough. Your patients are smarter than mine, I'd say. Joe, I'd definitely be wanting to. Well, I suppose I wouldn't be smart enough to say it how you said it. I think that's probably more accurate than my patients. But yeah, we're out of time, mate. Thank you so much. We definitely need to revisit this and all corners of it as time passes. But people can tune in to the Massage Matters podcast and other materials from the Massage Collective on social media and across all good podcast players in order to get more of your thoughts on these sorts of topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for giving me the opportunity to just brain dump as well. It's good to help get my thoughts in order.
Absolutely. I've just posted a link to the Therapy Live Sport. We've released the final 1,000 tickets to that event. And the session list, although it's not quite a program yet, is out now. And so do check that out, because, they're going to be snapped up. And Matt and his Massage Collective squad will be presenting at Therapy Live Sport and discussing these things in the context of massage for recovery. So please do join us for that. And thanks again, Matt. We'll speak soon, mate.
No worries. Cheers. Cheers, Jack.
Cheers.